Hi, everyone. Welcome to this middle grade debut panel, Spooky Vibe season, because even though it's not Spooktober yet, it's like the closest weekend before Spooktober that we could get to. I'm really excited to be chatting about middle grade debut. I was just talking with someone, I think last week or a couple weeks ago, about how I feel like I'm in my middle grade renaissance. Like, I feel like I'm enjoying middle grade books again for the first time in a while. And so I'm really happy that we'll be able to do this middle grade panel. If you don't know who I am, my name is Lily. I am the moderator for this panel, and I am the face behind Utopia State of Mind. So now we're going to have our authors and panelists, or author/panelists, um, introduce themselves. We're going to get into questions that I had when I finished these books. And then if anyone has any questions during the chat, then you can leave them in the live chat box, and I will keep an eye on them and come back to them afterwards. So Jenna, do you want to start with the author intros?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jenna Lee Yoon, the author of The Last Rewitch. It's a middle grade contemporary fantasy set at a summer sleepaway camp set in Washington State. I myself am located in Washington. I live there with my husband, my 14-year-old son, 12-year-old daughter, and our mini golden doodle Boba. If you get my newsletters, you get little updates on him all the time. When I'm not spending time with my family or writing, I work as a clinical psychologist. And The Last Rewitch is my debut novel. A little bit about the story. It's about a 12-year-old girl named Ronnie, and that's her depicted right here. And she really likes to be in control of everything so much that if she can't predict the outcome of something, she's not going to do it. So as you can imagine, when her dad sends her to summer camp, she's really resistant to that because she's never been before. And she's also not the kind of kid that will believe in magic, ghosts, witches, or goblins. But then at the camp, she finds that it's haunted by a Kishin, who then starts haunting her. And a Kishin is a Korean ghost. And at first, she tries to ignore it, kind of brushes it off. But eventually, she finds out that the Kishin will not stop bothering her because the Kishin wants to warn her about a Tokebi, a Korean goblin that is after her. So then she has to team up with the Kishin, who of course she did not believe in and does not want to believe in, to fight off that Tokebi. And all the while she's trying to survive things like the high ropes course, changing friendships, unwanted frenemies, and a deadly mystery. And so all the while she's doing all the camp stuff. And along the way, she's going to find out some things about herself, her friends, and her own family history that's connected to the summer camp.
Joan, do you want to introduce your book?
Sure. So I'm Joan Reardon. I'm also a debut middle grade author. My book, The Grimsbane Family Witch Hunter, is released on August 20th. It's a middle grade contemporary fantasy with sort of spooky vibes. It's about a family who 400 years ago were cursed by the most dangerous witch in the Midwest, where all of the men are cursed, and so all the women became witch hunters to try and hunt the witch who cursed the men. The curse sets in on the Grimsbane men's 13th birthday, and Anna and her twin brother are on the verge of their 13th birthday. So Anna's twin brother, Billy, he goes off into the haunted forest on the edge of town to hunt the witch by himself. So Anna and her friends go after him to try and rescue him from the witch and potentially break the curse. And it all takes place on Halloween, which is pretty fun. So in my free time, I'm a full-time attorney. So that's my sort of day job. I'm also a newlywed. I have a trip to Vermont coming up. So there's a lot of fun stuff going on. But that's kind of me.
Perfect. Well, my first question, and first of all, I deeply empathized with Ronnie's lack of desire to go to summer camp. I don't think I've ever been to summer camp, and I didn't realize it until I was reading the book, and I was like, wait, have I been to summer camp? I don't think I have. So when I was reading it, I was like, yeah, I also don't want to go. Like, I'm totally with you.
Yeah, it's a scary experience though, to like be pulled away from your family and spend so many nights away for the first time, usually for a kid at that age. But it's so much fun, Lily. One day I hope you do get to go to summer camp.
I would love that now. I think I hopefully could handle it better as an adult than I could as a middle grader. but yeah, was reading that and I was like, wow, I
Mhm.
realized I've never actually, or I never went when I was a kid,
Yeah.
obviously.
Mhm.
Um, so the first question that I have is kind of just about the topic of being a debut writer. And it's, could you both tell me about your journey to publication? What was the first image of the book you had, and now to post-publication? Because one of the things I think that I've seen with all these debut panels I've been doing is that everyone's road is so different.
Yeah.
And there are like 5 million ways basically to get to release and to post-publication. So I just want to know everything about it, basically, from both of you.
Do you want to just keep going like in order? I'm very much Ronnie, and I'm very like routine. I'll
Yeah,
skip
we could do
things. So
that.
if you don't mind,
That
Jo.
works. That way you go first too, so
Okay.
it takes some of the pressure off me.
So this is always a fun question to answer, and I always struggle to kind of keep it concise. So just like, give me a note, if I'm just going on too long. But it's fun because, like, unlike a lot of writers that I know, I didn't start writing as a young kid or even as a teen. I didn't even know writing was a thing. Like, you could be an author. I didn't even consider the concept of being an author until I was way adult. I did read since I was really young. And that is, well, of course, what connects almost every single author that I know, is we're all big readers first. But yeah, so for me, I didn't even think about writing until I was in grad school. And then I just had this thought, I would like to write a story. And that was the very first draft of The Last Three Witch. And I say that very hesitantly because that draft of The Last Three Witch was not even called The Last Three Witch, and there were no witches in it. It was like, I would say 98% different from what I even wrote as the second actual first draft of the book, if that makes sense. Anyway, wrote that. I just wrote it like in a few months for fun and just because I felt like I wanted to. And I was in grad school, so that I set it aside, finished grad school, and then I decided, while I was like, I just had my second baby, I was still in internship. I was so sleep deprived, and I really needed that like kind of outlet, that escape. And so I started reading young adult fantasy, which I had never read before, and it was so much fun. And it was, it was like, it opened my eyes to a whole new world, and that really inspired me to start writing again and really consider publication. And so I really dove into like SCBWI and kind of learning all about what it means to actually publish a book and to write a book. And as many people understand, when they start trying to writing a book or a novel is so different from writing like an academic paper. So my very first draft of a book was very academic. You know what I mean? It wasn't, the craft was, terrible. It was well written grammatically, but it just, no one would ever buy that book, which is fine. I never even thought about publishing that one. But so fast forward like 15 years later, I finally brushed off the middle grade. So that was in like 2020. So only a few years ago, I guess, that I actually rewrote The Last Three Witch into what it kind of is now. And I entered author mentor match, and that was one of the online, like, Twitter based, not only Twitter based, but the community was on Twitter where you get mentorship. And so I did that. I've met my mentor, Shayna Targos, who has a book coming out next year. She's amazing, and she taught me everything I know. And then I worked with her to revise The Last Three Witch in several months, I think. And then I queried the book, and a few months later, I got my agent, revised with her. And my revisions are always really massive. So it changed a lot over the course of those two revisions. And then we went out on sub, and it was a few months before I got my offer with Disney. And then it was this kind of standard almost 2 years between getting that book deal to what we have now, which is a book. And that book came out in May 2024, this year. And so the picture is very different. The book is entirely different. Only things that stayed the same are the name of the camp and the fact that it was set at a summer camp, and the names of two side characters, Jack and Sam. But even the relationships between the characters, completely different. And like I said, there were no witches, no goblins, nothing spooky in the book at all. So literally a completely different story. So yeah, a completely different picture, but I'm very happy with what I have now. And I think that the book that we have now I couldn't have come up with that if I had tried to write that so many years ago when I wrote that very first draft of my very first book ever. So, yay.
All right. I'll go next just because it's the only other option. All right. So writing has always pretty much been a constant in my life. Even, the time, like I can remember being like 5 and 6 years old and having a writing club with my sister where we would make up stories and then present them to our parents. I'd always been a reader. In middle school, I used to do a competitive writing competition that there was like in my state, Ohio, Power of the Pen. And I was really, really into that. I also did like English Festival, which is another, competitive writing competition. So I was really, really involved in that. I was constantly writing. So I was also very aware of the publishing industry because my parents are always very supportive of anything my siblings and I were doing. And I remember my dad, when I was like 9 or 10 years old, got me a book about this thick about the publishing industry. So I read that cover to cover, made notes, and then I remember making a checklist for how to publish a book when I was that age. And the first step was like, get a literary agent, which of course didn't happen until like 2020. But all through high school, I wrote a book. I never, even considered querying that because like I queried it to like 5 agents. And then after receiving rejections, I was like, this was way too personal. And then I took a break from writing in college, even though like, I was writing short stories and stuff just, I enjoy it mentally. It's kind of like how I meditate. But then, I was graduating in 2020. And as we know, during 2020, the entire world shut down. So with, a ton of free time, moved back into my parents' house as in my childhood bedroom. And I was also entering, as we were talking about before, sort of middle grade renaissance where I was reading a ton of the old middle grade books I had on all my childhood bookshelves. And I figured, this is where I first fell in love with writing. I might as well try and write a middle grade. So I was also a history major in undergrad. So I was really focused on like wrapping up that degree and everything I learned there. So the first thing I wrote was sort of like a history of the Grimsbane family from like, from the time they were in England until like modern times. And it's like, 20 pages, but it really did summarize everything. That was the first thing I knew about the family was their history. So from there, I started drafting, wrote the book, submitted to literary agents and got an agent, just cold querying, nothing special, nothing fancy. Then it went on sub. We did a couple of rounds of edits, but, it was a very straightforward process. So yeah, now it's published, which is great.
We're like the opposite, Joan. Like literally, I can't believe you knew all that as a kid, like about the publishing industry. I didn't even know that existed, like that whole world. So when I dove in, it was like learning a whole new like language pretty much. So that's amazing.
No, yeah, I very much speed ran it as like an 8-year-old, which
wow,
is
oh my God.
interesting. And of course, it did change, like with the rise of social media and all that stuff. But I was always aware that there was like things that existed like agents and publishers and like how like, a publicist works. It was just sort of
that's amazing.
It was nice having that book. So kudos to my dad for being very proactive. But yeah, this is all going on. I was also in law school, throughout the entire publication process. So while querying, I started my first semester and sort of finished writing the book then. And so, yeah, it was kind of all tangled together, law school and publication of the Grimsbane Family Witch Hunters. So it was an interesting time because Jenna, you also wrote your book during law school. I mean, not law school, grad school. It's pretty interesting,
Yeah, that is really interesting because I feel like I didn't know about anything in publishing till a couple of years ago, basically. So now I really want to know what this book is, and I feel like I should read this book.
I can't even remember the title of it. I remember it had like cartoons on the cover, and I remember like it had very small print, which I was like very shocked by as a child because I was used to like just typical books. But
yeah, the juxtaposition of like small print and cartoons, I find that fascinating.
Hey, as did I. I was like, but I remember taking notes and then making a checklist. But yeah, eventually started my checklist in 2020, was finally able to like check and keep moving on.
It was finally ready. That brings up a really one of my next questions, which were kind of what were some of both of your most influential middle grade books? I know that Joan, you just mentioned that you had been rereading them basically in preparation for the Grimsbane Witch Hunters. Do you want to start, Joan, and talk about like what books?
Yes. So for me, the most influential middle grade book I ever read was Percy Jackson. I was wholeheartedly like obsessed with it when I was in middle school, and it's the reason I became so interested in history, which is why I became a history major, and like, part of the reason I got so interested in American history and then became a lawyer and all that stuff. So it was very, very important to me growing up. And I actually got the chance to meet Rick Riordan when I was 12 years old, and it was like right when Heroes of Olympus was coming out. And so, they were doing like the signings and all that stuff. And my dad took my sister and I all the way to Pittsburgh, and we waited in line for like 2 hours to meet him. And we were allowed to ask him one question because it was such a busy event. And I had like this big, long question prepared in my head. And then I got to him and I just froze, like could not speak. I was just completely starstruck, and he was very nice. He signed my book and everything. But yeah, there's like a picture of me with like my eyes are just like this big, just looking at him, just like, I can't believe he's real. But yeah, so I was, Percy Jackson was super important to me.
Yeah. So for me, I'd have to split this, like, the influence from like as a reader, because I'm in the era of like when it was only, well, what was widely available at the time when I was a middle grade reader was like Sweet Valley Kid, Sweet Valley High, Babysitter's Club, Nancy Drew, Christopher Pike, and I devoured all of those books. And those books are the ones that made me a reader. But as a writer, that's different because there was a time, it's always funny when I admit this because I'm like, I don't think I should admit this, but I will because I'm very honest and open, is that I didn't read for a while. I didn't read for fun. After middle grade, I kind of there was no YA back then. I'm pretty old. And so YA wasn't a thing. And unlike my sister who jumped into like full on adult books when she was, 13, I was like, those were boring for me. And so I just didn't read until like college. And then I started to read just for fun, and I jumped into the classics, which is weird thing to do. But what really inspired me to write middle grade was just remembering what I loved about reading as a middle grader, and then wanting to read more contemporary, things that were coming out now. And so it really is authors like Julie Abe, Eva Evergreen series, and like Gracie Kim, The Last Fallen Star. They both blurred my book, which is amazing because they are the ones who made me fall in love with middle grade fantasy, especially once again. And so they are the most influential, like, authors and books for me as a writer.
Yeah, I feel like my middle grade journey was more kind of like what you were saying, Jenna. I feel like as a child, I went kind of like your sister, right? I went like from middle grade, like Tamara Pierce books to like adult urban fantasy books. And I like didn't really have
There's
a
no
YA
material.
period.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then I feel like it went to kind of what you were talking about with, so like going back to YA and now going back to middle grade.
Regressing, but in the best way.
Yeah, exactly. My tastes are getting younger in terms of the book I'm finding comfort in, the things that I'm really enjoying. But that brings me kind of to my next question for both of you, which is what draws you specifically to the middle grade genre? And I guess sub question wise, also to spooky like middle grade genre or fantastical middle grade. And do you see parallels between, because I think what both of your books were interesting in the way that they talk about kind of like monsters and the fears that we have associated with monsters and that. And so I wanted to ask as well if you both see parallels between monsters and external and internal fears specifically for middle grade readers. So like just 3 questions all together in one. Jenna, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll probably answer them to varying degrees. But I think what more than spooky specifically, because I think I wasn't always, there are some people who are just like, I love horror, middle grade horror, and I do love reading them. But I don't consider myself a specifically horror writer. It's more of like the fantastical bend. And let's admit that fantasy at the root, at the birth, it's kind of creepy, right? A lot of the fantastical stories, when they are based on like lore or myth, even like Disney stories, as we all know, they're really quite horror-esque when you get down to the root of the story. If you strip out the Disney, washing out of the horror elements. But anyway, I just really love fantasy, especially contemporary fantasy, because it allows me to create a world that is like our own, but I get to infuse magic that I wish I could see in our real world. And then I love the idea that the readers will set aside their disbelief for just a moment while reading the book and allow themselves to believe in that magic that I've created, and and open themselves to the possibility that there is magic kind of hiding in plain sight, which again is very specific to contemporary fantasy rather than high fantasy, right? Like maybe it's there, we just don't see it. And then also the idea that normal people like us can harness that magic and change lives, and maybe even save the world. And so, especially when you add in monsters or anything scary, it gives the characters, like the ones you hope that kids will identify with the characters in the story. So it gives all the readers a chance to face off with something tangible. And a lot of fears are not tangible, right? They're symbolic, they're emotional, they're relational. But giving something tangible to fight, like, you know, a tokebi, a goblin, or a witch, right? Whether you see them as good witches or bad witches. But the idea that you can like address and face your fears to a level that you're comfortable with, especially with kids. We don't want to push them and force them. Here's a fear. Let go ahead and face it head on, right? But in a story, you get to kind of engage or disengage as much as you want, and face off and question and just explore that fear in a way that feels safe. And so it allows kids to determine their own boundaries in, you know, in facing that challenge and facing that fear. And so I think that that's a wonderful place in a story to do that. And it's a very story specific beauty that we have. And then when the readers step aside and step away from that story, my hope is that they carry some of that hopefulness, some of that bravery, some of that curiosity, or even just like feeling seen in your fear. I hope that they can carry that, you know, throughout the rest of their world, just a little bit in their real lives, even after they've closed the book, you know, on that story. Yeah. How about you, Joan?
Yeah, so in terms of like why I write fantasy, I'm just a huge nerd. Like it's not really terribly complicated. I love wizards, witches, dragons, can't get enough of it. So I don't think I'll ever write contemporary ever. I just, you know, maybe some sci-fi, but you know, everything that I consume, you know, as a like reader, as someone who watches television, I like fantasy is my genre, always has been. In terms of horror, I am probably the biggest chicken who's ever walked the earth. So it's not something that I typically read. It's not something you know, I particularly enjoy. But I think the reason that I turned to, you know, the more horrific elements for the Grimsbanes is because I took this fabulous class during my last semester of undergrad called Tolkien's Monsters because I needed an English credit to graduate. And it was about how J.R.R. Tolkien came up with all of the monsters in Lord of the Rings and all of the history behind that. And so it was interesting learning that, like, what the actual purpose of monsters are in a story, and more importantly, what the purpose of a monster is in society. Because the word monster comes from the same root word as like monument, demonstrate, which is teaching us, it's like a warning, a reminder of something. So what do monsters tell us about the society we're in? What are they warning us about? And oftentimes, you know, when you're looking like through the history of where a monster comes from, it can be from some not cool places. So it's important to be mindful of that.
Mhm.
So I think that's just kind of why, you know, with the themes of the Grimsbane family witch hunters, I turn to horror because we're told this is what you should be afraid of. Here's why you should be afraid of it. Which is sort of tangoing with that idea. So, yeah.
We just got a really, really great question. I really love it. But it's specifically kind of what you're talking about, Joan, just right now about sort of horror and fears being connected. And so the question is, what do you think about the idea that horror is inherently rooted in grief? And do you both think that this still applies in middle grade?
This is my first time hearing this idea. I
know it's my first time hearing it too, so it's like
I'm just trying to think about it real quick. My understanding of horror is that it comes from something like innate survival most of the time. So to use an example, just from the Grimsbane family witch hunters, when I talk about the melonheads, I try to use like insect-like language, like scuttling, you know, walking around on all fours, just because people are scared of, you know, insects generally. But it does come from like that inherent warning, like, you know, that fight or flight, you know, there's something to be afraid of, there's something to survive. That's where I think horror typically comes from, is just that innate primal fear that all humans have.
I think maybe I interpret the question or comment a bit differently. I wonder if they mean like how grief and loss, it has a lot to do with unknowns, right? Like we don't know you have people have beliefs about what happens after life, but we don't really know exactly what the experience of dying or losing someone might be, unless you're in that moment. And there's a lot of unknown about what happens next, not only to the person you lost, but to your own life, and your relationship with that person. Where does that go? And I can see how that is really tied into to the idea of horror and fears in general, because fears are often based on what's not known, right? And so we say like face your fears, because once you face them, it becomes a little less scary. So I think that there is a very strong tie. Yeah, and I've never really thought of it as being exactly rooted in grief, but I can see how there are a lot of connections. And when you do see books on horror, you do see a lot of times there is a lot of grief and loss intertwined in those stories. Like mine, like definitely my book is heavy on grief and loss and saying goodbye, and again on the whole unknowns and Ronnie's difficulties with grasping or sitting in the unknown, sitting in uncertainty. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I wonder. I was thinking about this too because it's also the first time that I've heard this as well, and I'm now like obsessed. But I think one of the things that I thought about when I was reading that question is like the idea of ghosts
Mhm.
and just the idea of like specters in general. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of different figures that exist in horror, but ghosts specifically to me, you have these portrayals of different like ghosts within stories and the ways that ghosts can come from like anger and they also can come with
Mm.
grief and unresolved
Yeah.
things. And I feel like Anna, your book has also some like those ties, kind of like what you were saying.
Mhm.
Um, but another thing I also thought about with the question too was I haven't heard about the grief, but I've heard a lot about the connection between monsters and transformation, and this idea of like transforming between monsters, like people, okay, not people, but like being transformed into a monster, basically,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
how this idea of being a monster is sort of related to your sphere of like internally what that reflects in you.
Mhm.
Um, so it's interesting that when we think about horror, it is like tied to all of these really, really strong, intense emotions of like fear and anger and grief and also transformation.
Mhm.
Um, if we have time later, I want to ask about that too, because I think it's one of the, well, I guess I can just ask about it now. I think that one of the things I really love as well about middle grade, and I think that you see that a lot in both of your books, is that I think for middle grade readers, a lot of them are kind of at this transformation period or this point, right? Where things like before were one way and things after are different. And I feel like for both of your books, you see this theme of transformation on a variety of different levels, whether that means internally, they change how they think about the world, or they change how they think about, people or people's relationships to them transform in ways that are different so from before.
Yeah.
So I feel like for both of your books specifically, and the segue that I will put for it about them are the friendships, and specifically, I guess for Joan, yours and like the sibling relationship, not necessarily about the friendships like for Jenna's, but
Mhm.
the idea of the fear of transforming that relationship, the friendship and like the family relationship. So I wonder if you both could talk about that theme or that concept in relation to, for example, sibling and also in relationship to friendships and this um, the anxieties in some ways and the conflict points that you have both of you between these kind of central core relationships for your characters. Jenna, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think writing about friendships and changing friendships and identities is just so natural. It's an evergreen topic in middle grade because developmentally, that's where kids are right now. They're really kind of learning about who they are. They're deciding who they want to be. And they're hoping that when they look into themselves, that's what they're finding. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of times at this age, of course, and any age, but this age particularly, relationships are so important, but they also feel so very fragile, especially the peer relationships, because everyone, around that age, you're all changing a lot physically, emotionally, the way you think, all the pressures are different. And so as with all these growing pains, the kids are looking inward at who they are, looking outward at who their friends and people who are important are. And also they're looking at themselves through the lens of their peers. And this is, of course, skewed by what they think, how they think they are being perceived, right, through other people's lenses. And they're determined that by how strong that relationship feels, right, how in line they feel they are with their friends or their peers. And excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. And also just how much or what they value and how that changes. And so this makes it very complicated. All these complicated feelings of, this is who I'm supposed to be best friends with. I'm supposed to be this person's best friend. I'm supposed to be this type of daughter, this type of kid, this type of student. And all of those, pressures really add a lot of, again, pressure onto relationships. And so I think those themes come in naturally to almost all middle grade stories. And I think that's also why, like, I was drawn so much to the whole, like, Ronnie is holding on so tightly to her relationships, and not just the relationships, but her role in the relationships, because that's what she knows. That's what she knows she's good at, and that's what she's comfortable with. And so as soon as that starts to change, as people around her change, she gets very scared, because then she doesn't know how she's going to be or who she's going to be in this new, in this new relationship where there are other friends, right? And there are new friends, people that she doesn't know, and her friends have their own new friends. And so that can be really just like really scary to feel like you don't know who you are or who you are supposed to be. And so that's what really draws me to middle grade, I think, is that these really deep, strong feelings that come along with identity that we kind of we still struggle with as adults, but I think it's a lot more raw when you're, like anywhere from like 9 to 12.
Yep, I totally agree with everything Jenna said. I'm drawn to middle grade for a lot of the same reasons because, first of all, that's when kids first fall in love with reading for the most part. And it's also when they're starting to choose books for themselves, like what they're interested in. They could sort of delve into the concepts and ideas that have meaning to them personally. I also think that middle grade age of 8 to 12, like, that you're a human by that point, but you're questioning what it means to be human and where you exist within that greater sphere of like your family, your friends, your school, and just trying to figure out where you fit in. And I think it's like questioning where you fit in, but it's also having like that expectation of who you are and who you expect others to be. Mm-hmm. So I feel like in my book with the sibling relationship, Anna has like a very, very clear view of what her life is going to be like, and she's attempting to achieve that. And then she finds out that her brother has a very, very different idea of what his life is going to be like, which is something difficult that like all siblings sort of go through at some point, is like, you want to be together as a family. I'm very close with both my siblings, I should note. So I guess not every sibling group goes through this. Not every friend group goes through this. But it's just sort of figuring out that like, hey, you're going to have to like go on different paths, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like where that sibling idea came from for the Grimsbane family witch hunters. And it's also Anna and Billy are on that cusp of becoming a teenager, like that 12 to 13 switch, which is like pretty difficult. It's just trying to figure out like, hey, you're getting older, you're going to be in high school. And again, they have like completely different views of what that's going to look like for them. And they're both experiencing what it feels like getting left behind, which is kind of why I created the forest as a sort of setting where they both go into it and come out transformed and more mature and understanding like who they are as people, and that it's okay to let go a little bit of the world around you and let other people find their path and recognize it doesn't mean they love you any less. It's just, it's okay to have differences in that sense and where you think your life is going, and accept what others want to do with their own lives.
Yeah, going back, Jenna, to what you were saying also about friendship and the roles that Ronnie has, that brings me to my next question for specifically the last rewitch, which is that you have these different specific situations for friendships. And as you said, with the roles of friendships, I wanted to ask how you used summer camp specifically as a setting to develop and talk about these, because you have new friends and you have old friends, or like new friends and established friends. Mm-hmm. And they have very, very different kind of opinions and also very different roles and ways that they've happened, basically.
Yeah, and to be completely honest, I can't recall how I came about to setting the story at a summer camp. But at this point, I can't imagine the story working in any other setting, right? I mean, it literally is necessary. And I think that that's how things are with when I write. Whatever you see now, it's like I feel like it is very necessary and it should have been there all along. And it's only when everything sort of clicks together like a puzzle piece that I realize that okay, my story is done and ready to go. But yeah, so like Ronnie, she's being haunted by a ghost that is also haunting that summer camp, which is surrounded by a large forest where the ghost is kind of like anchored in. And she needs to have a lot of interactions with peers. And some of these peers, no, most of the peers, she doesn't know. They're not her friends. Only Jack is her friend, her one best friend, who she kind of followed to summer camp and is hoping to kind of reclaim their friendship because he's changing a lot and doing like a lot of normal kid things. And Ronnie at this point does not feel very normal and she doesn't like that. And so she wants to kind of like, latch on to Jack. But because it's a summer camp setting, she is sort of forced into it's like forced proximity, right? In romance books, she's forced into these interactions with other kids, especially a girl named Olivia, who is like every girl should have a friend like Olivia, and she kind of latches on to Ronnie, and all of these kids are so different. They're all pieces of Ronnie that she is not. Some of them she wishes that she could be. Some she just automatically shuns, like those kinds of characteristics. But these other friends, these side characters are all they all grew and developed from that. And she has to be interacting with them frequently. And it's kind of nice that when you're at summer camp, there is a little less adult supervision than maybe at home or at school. I went to a summer camp with my kid. I have 12 and 14-year-olds, which is a lot of fun. It's insane. But yeah, so everything you talked about 12-year-olds. Oh my God. Yes. But so I went to a fifth grade, like summer camp, a sleepaway camp. And I was so shocked by the amount of freedom the kids get. I don't mean freedom to just go wild, but as in they're very trusted to, be at this place at this time. Like just be there. Like with your friends. Just go and show up. And I was like, wait, what? Like no one's gonna be like walking, you know what I mean? There's no teacher walking them from one place to another. It's like this big, the grounds, of course, are secure. And within that large space, the kids are given a lot more freedom than they would be, out in like our communities, right? And because of that, that allows for a lot of like creative, process, a lot of storytelling opportunities that I wouldn't have had in like, a normal neighborhood setting. So yeah, so the summer camp was very necessary for that setting. And I've kind of lost track of your question, Lily. Sorry, you asked about summer camp, and I swear there were roles in your question. Was there a question about?
It was about, no, I think you were kind of answering, right? Like how you use summer camp as specifically the setting to kind of advance and talk about the friendship problems that Ronnie's having.
Yeah,
Because everything you're talking about makes total sense, right? Like what you're saying, like forced proximity, right? Everyone is forced. And also, having never been to summer camp, but having watched many movies, I can assume that that in summer camp as well, you are, you're forced to mix in groups of friends and groups of strangers you've never met.
yes, and in situations that you've never been in and you would never choose to be in. And these are things that you may be good at or you may be really horrible at. But so it's all sorts of uncomfortable, and that brings out all the characteristics, all your personality in a really rich way. So yeah, and that it's really just adding like it's everything that you need that a storyteller wants. It's like a sort of freedom that you don't normally get. And so it was a lot of fun to be able to put up all these different personalities together, mash them up together, and put them in scenarios that they wouldn't otherwise have been in.
Yeah, that's perfect way to describe it. Like you force them into so many outside of their comfort zone
Yeah.
kind of situations. They have to grow. They have to grow or they have to leave, basically.
No choice.
John, I want to ask you. We already talked a little bit about it, but specifically Anna and Billy's relationship, and I want to know how you decided to curse Billy, and also because what you were talking about as well with kind of the visions both of them have of their futures and how they have that moment where they like think they're on the same page, and then all of a sudden Anna's like, "Wait, aren't we?" And then it's like, "No, we're really not." And so, could you talk about Billy and Billy's curse And also how you then have Anna kind of have to figure out what to do with that, like sort of really simple, I guess, in some ways, but very abrupt change of sort of perspective.
Yeah, so originally, actually, in like the earliest draft of this, before I like changed it, both the men and the women were cursed. And then after like a couple chapters of that, I was like, it's really, really hard to write like a brawn-based character who is like cursed to die, like a horrible, miserable death, just because Anna is like such like a gung-ho fighter type character. So I think the reason that I ended up with only Billy being cursed is it's sort of like, you know, you're watching someone that you love go through something that you can't help with, you know, which I think someone like, you know, you experience just generally like throughout life. There's like an issue that a friend or a family member is having, and you can be there and you can support them through it, but there's not really much you can do to change the situation. So I think it was just Anna sort of dealing with that is where that inspiration sort of came from.
We have another really great question, and it's kind of all on the themes of siblings and friends and everything related to that. But it's how do themes of blood family or biological family versus found family and the idea of who you're supposed to be, you know, like supposed to in quotation marks, friends with versus who you choose to be friends with tie into your stories. Jenna, do you want to talk about it first? Because you kind of, you know, it's very on brand for the last rewrite.
Yeah, I think I think in terms of supposed to be, in terms of friendships, I think that all came from within from Ronnie, which is a little different from I think other stories. Like it was like her idea that Jack was her best friend since they were in diapers, and so their dads are best friends, and so this is going to be her best friend forever, and this is the only friend she needs. So she's got her best friend in one hand and her dad in the other, and she was good to go for life. And so she felt, because she can be kind of rigid, like me. And so she felt like if she were to add any friends, like she'd have to let go a little bit of her, friendship with Jack. And this is kind of a funny thing that I feel like even adults kind of joke about this. Like, what? You can't make a new friend. Like, who's this new friend, right? Because it's just like kind of a joking jealousy about if you give your heart to someone else, there's a little bit less for me, which we know that it's not true, especially if you have kids. You can have 10 kids, which sounds hard, but you'll love them all fully, right? And so I think with friendships, it's like that too. Your heart just grows. And then hopefully if your friends are friends, it's a lot of fun and, spoiler, but kind of obvious one. Of course, as Ronnie, grows her friendship circle, she finds that there's more love and more support and that there's more of herself to give and share. But yes, I think that there is a very strong rigidity to like, if this is what I have to give, I'm going to give it to you, and then you're going to give it to me, and that's pretty much it. We don't have room for anything else because I'm happy. You should be happy. And in found families, also in my book, there is a found family at the end that goes beyond the friends, and it kind of continues on into book 2 because Ronnie can't actually merge her found family with her actual her blood family, which is her dad. And Lily's like, yes, I know you're talking about. And so that is a struggle because actually, yeah, she does. I mean, everybody accepts her blood family. It's her and her dad, to the end. And her found family has to remain sort of hidden for a while. And so that is interesting because that's going to create even more of an identity challenge for Ronnie, even though she does kind of, overcome the friendship bit, the family bit does remain. So I think it's something that, not only does Ronnie continue to struggle with it, but I think we continue to struggle with it for our entire lives, right? As we enter in, romantic relationships as well. And all sorts of relationships. There's so much nuance there. It could go on forever.
Don't you want to talk about it? Sorry,
I got you. Don't worry. I'm going. I just had to unmute. So I feel like in the Grimsbane family witch hunters, we sort of do start off with both like the family element, like the actual Grimsbane family, but we also have the found family that's already there in the form of Anna and Billy's best friends, Suvi and Rosario, who are their neighbors who, like Jack, they've known since they were in diapers. But we do see that Billy is sort of starting to move away from that a little bit and try and be more independent, whereas Anna, Suvi, and Rosaria are still very dependent on each other, want to do everything together. And Billy is kind of getting to be more of a teenager, saying, I would like to try some things like on my own. I want to hang out with other people than just you guys, which is very, very difficult for the three of them to experience, because they say, hey, we have this group. We've had these traditions for years that we always do on Halloween, and you're trying to like just suddenly change that because we're getting older. Like, why would we want to go to a party when we can hang out with just the four of us? It's sort of the energy they're bringing to the table. So there is like a lot of expectations, I feel like, with friendships. And then when someone tries to take it in a different direction, especially when you're in middle school, it can feel like the whole world is crashing around you. And I feel like part of the reason that I came up with this friendship group was just because I was writing it during COVID, and like this giant family, because, you know, I have a huge family. My dad has 6 siblings. My mom has 2 brothers and 3 stepbrothers, and we're together constantly as a family group. And I was just missing them terribly. And I also, you know, I told my friends like, hey, see you after spring break during college. And then I didn't see a lot of them until 3 years later at my wedding. So it was just like a lot, just being completely separated from those groups, which is kind of how that idea of like separation and moving in different directions, sort of being out of your control, is where like that sort of idea came from.
Yeah, I loved reading some of the first scenes in the Grimsbane Witch Hunters book about like exactly like the feeling when that 4, right, when the square becomes a triangle, and and that feeling where and obviously we're in like Anna's perspective, like we're, you know, we're seeing the world through Anna's eyes, but like instantly when they're like, wait, where is Billy? And then like you feel that betrayal, and I felt it so strongly, and I was like, yeah, where is Billy? Like why is Billy not here, guys? I want to ask now in the last rewrite about, because one of the things that I really loved in the book is how Ronnie navigates her identity as feeling simultaneously like not enough and too much, and like this kind of imposter syndrome and not really realizing it. I mean, her and her dad obviously go through it in different ways, but her, specifically Ronnie, since Ronnie is like the main character of the book, I wanted to know if you could talk about this theme for, you know, new readers who haven't read the book, for example, and how Ronnie comes to terms or navigates kind of identity and being like the authority of like an ethnicity, and how that kind of unfolds for her.
Yeah, so Ronnie Miller, her last name is Miller, and that's because her dad, who is also Korean, was adopted by white parents. And he's actually not like, his identity or sense of identity isn't really explored in the book. Like Lily said, it's more about Ronnie. But what was important for me to stress is that Ronnie grew up with her dad, and so he didn't really like embrace, or he didn't really feel like an authority on, you know, Korean culture either, because he grew up very American. And then Ronnie's mom, who was more Koreanized, more like in her Korean heritage, she dies when Ronnie's 5. And so Ronnie looks very Korean, but she doesn't feel very Korean at all. She doesn't speak it very much. But of course, she enters a room, and if anything Korean comes up, everyone, you know, kind of, as we all know, we kind of everyone looks to you. And so that happened to me as well. You know, like I look very Korean or Asian. I heard I look very Chinese. I'll have like Chinese elderly women come up to me and ask me questions. And I feel so bad. I'm like, I'm not Chinese. I can't speak Chinese. But it's that idea that like people will look to the Asian person for all things East Asian sometimes, right? It doesn't matter if you're Korean or Japanese or Chinese or whatever. They'll look to you. And that makes Ronnie feel very much like an imposter, because her friend Jack, her best friend, he's half white, half Korean. But he actually knows a lot more about Korean culture. He knows the Korean language. He knows Korean lore. And so he does have more like expertise and more knowledge. And that again makes her feel even more like an imposter, because everyone will look to her, but Jack will have to answer for her. And even though like a lot of readers, not every reader will kind of identify with that, you know, not feeling Korean enough. Hopefully other, you know, people who are not Korean are also reading. But I think that all readers, especially young readers, can identify with not feeling enough. And I'm going to do a little spoiler here, but Ronnie also feels not like a witch enough, because she's never felt witchy. She doesn't even believe in witches, right? And so she goes through this phase where she's like, not only am I not Korean enough, I could not possibly be a witch. And then it's the Kishin telling her, being Korean, being a witch, it's in your blood, it's in your soul. It's not something that you can be enough of or not enough of. And I think that throughout the course of the story, Ronnie has to grapple with this like gray area. And that's important because when we feel like we're not enough of something, we're really flattening an identity and saying, this is what, to be enough of something, this is where you have to be. But being Korean American means that I see, being Korean is different through a different lens, a different experience. And I interpret things different. That is, things that are Korean. And there's so much nuance, which is, I think, great because then like so many stories, so many readers can benefit from all the stories that tackle, identity and not feeling enough in so many ways. So whether it's being, a certain, nationality or culture, whether it's being, a ghost or a witch, whether it's being a best friend or a new friend or a camp friend, a daughter, a sister, brother, whatever it is, we all feel like a fraud sometimes. And unfortunately, there are plentiful ways for, in which we make ourselves feel inadequate. And I think that's what this is all about, is like feeling inadequate, feeling not enough. And it's something that plagues a lot of, children at this age, as we've been talking about so far. And so I think books like Joan's, books like, hopefully like mine and other books that I've read, they really help you to see yourself in that story and see that it's, it's normal to feel that way. And whether you walk away with some insight or just feeling seen, I think that is enough. And I think that's a great part of middle grade books. That I think that's why we're drawn to them, right? Is that we remember being at that age and we remember how it does feel to know that you're not alone and you're not the, sole like weirdo experiencing something, right?
I'm glad you brought up the witch thing because I wrote this question a few different times and I was like, oh, can I like say that? I don't know if I can say that. Like it seems a little bit like maybe a spoiler. So I just was like, if she's exploring,
Yeah.
like,
I feel like now that it's been like several months, I think it's okay, right? And it's so cute. Like I'm sure I think other like young readers have spoiled that, and I love it the way they've spoiled that for people. So I'm like, yeah, the more we can say, I think it's better. It helps readers to know what they're in for. Right?
mm-hmm. John, one of the things, or one of my favorite themes actually in the Grimsbane Witch Hunters was your exploration of the idea that not everything that we're told or not everything we even believe is true. I don't know how better to describe that. But and you talked a little bit about that as well, kind of discovering that. And specifically, I loved how you talked about how you had like the family history already as kind of like a document before you jumped into the book. Because family history, the stories we are told, the monsters that we are told, like the whole kind of stories that we're told kind of is a huge theme in your book. And so I would love to know if you could talk about what drew you to this theme, its importance in the story, without spoilers, or with spoilers. I've read the book, so like with or without spoilers is up to you, as well as how it developed, maybe if it changed, through editing and drafting and whatnot.
Yeah, I'm going to do my very best to avoid spoilers, but I'm making absolutely no promises to anyone. So, again, part of the reason I wrote this book is I was finishing up my history degree at Ohio State, and I felt like I learned so much because I'd always been so interested in history, again, from the time I was in middle school. I started reading Percy Jackson. But a lot of the times when you're actually reading history, you're reading someone else's interpretation of primary sources rather than your own, interpretation of it. So I didn't really get to interact a lot with primary sources until I got to college and was actually getting to, pull up people's letters and like what they actually thought about certain situations, like pages from their diaries. And I was like, oh, so like they were aware of this issue and they were just making terrible decisions. I guess it's just sort of like when you're looking at certain historical figures. And I think also the Tolkien's Monsters class was really eye-opening for me because, I'd never read the books, but I had seen the movies and I just never questioned where a lot of those ideas that he was presenting were coming from, like in terms of his own history and his own biases within his own culture. And I was like, I really wish that I had encountered that idea at a much younger age. you know, like I wish that I knew about these ideas and was thinking more critically about them when I was in middle school, when I was in high school, and even earlier in college. So that's kind of where that idea of like Diligence's diary and this primary source that was, you know, a reflection of the family's entire history, but was written from very biased sources because it's only like the Grimsbane's women's interpretation of the monsters that they were encountering in their family history, which is obviously going to be, you know, very prejudiced, like in their favor, like very biased towards them. So Anna sort of like has to tango with the idea of like everything that I was told by these authority figures in my life, like they're not bad people, but it might not be entirely true.
Mm.
And so it was sort of encouraging middle grade readers to think critically, both when, you know, you're hearing things from authority figures, you're dealing with any sort of secondary source, is to question bias within those sources. So that's where that idea came from.
Yeah, and I love how also you are it like starts super super subtly. I feel like part of it, and that's also I also want to love to know if like when you know when you had that idea, if you kind of immediately were able to kind of figure out how you wanted that journey or that evolution to happen on the page, because when you do start it, it seems it's like so subtly there. You know, you see a comment or two, and then obviously as an adult reader, we're keyed into seeing it, and then you kind of grow that, you know, as the chapters go on for Anna to really understand. So did Anna's sort of evolution with that theme, was it always kind of mapped out like that, or did you have to really kind of go back and reconsider, you know, when to push, when to pull back a little bit?
Yes. So my goal was for like the first few chapters for middle grade readers to be like wholeheartedly like team witch hunter. We were going to get out in that forest. We were going to hunt that witch with a golf club. And this is like a normal thing for a human being to do. And then I wanted them to sort of grow as Anna does, like, hey, like to be in her shoes as well as she's going through the forest and like have their own biases like questioned that they got from like Anna's perspective, because Anna, very much like the other women in the family, has like a completely biased view that needs to change by the time, you know, she gets out of the forest if there's going to be a more positive history going forward. So yeah, no, it was very intentional to try and get the reader to have to go through the theme as Anna does and sort of change their own view about what they were told by me, unfortunately, and by Anna and the other Grimsbanes
As
at the
they were
beginning of the
lied to by you.
story. Yeah, and sort of like have to work through the really negative aspects of, you know, monster hunting and cryptid hunting and witch hunting and like the actual impact that has on, you know, witches, monsters, and cryptids, and like also like how they think it's their right to choose what it means to be a monster and like what it means like to exist in the world, like where you're putting that on someone else, and what it means to be human, and like sort of separating the two. I just wanted, as Anna grows, I wanted the reader to kind of tango with the ideas themselves and like have that bias implanted in them and change it throughout the story so they could hopefully do it when they're encountering history.
Yeah. Because there's also and of the questions, you know, that the individual questions, I thought this was actually one of the questions that works the best for both of your books as well. Because I feel like The Last Rewitch also, and of course, like I don't know how to phrase this question, but The Last Rewitch also like folk talks about this idea of like whether or not the people we think are against us are really against us, or like whether or not we think that they're bad because we're told to, or like are they actually good, right? I think both of your books talk about kind of this that cyclical cycle you get into, right? Where you like are told something, so you assume something is bad. And so everything they do, obviously, like confirmation bias, right? Like everything they do will immediately then be like, oh yeah, this is what they did. And they did this because they were bad. And I was told that they were bad. So like they're definitely bad. And then it just keeps going on and on and on.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about both of your books. They like both kind of are like, wait, but like really? So that I want to end this panel by asking a very fall question, because as I said, September is basically over. We're basically in Halloween month. We're kind of like in the middle, I feel like, of fall, basically. And so I wanted to know, what fall traditions either of you have, or if you have any fall traditions, I guess, or like fall things that you love. Jenna, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I mean, most writers love the fall. It's like our bias season, right? It's so beautiful. So I always think of like going back to school when fall comes because I went to school like forever, and it's in a good way. I love school, or going to school. But I love going like foliage hunting and going to look and drive around. Yeah, and but there is a tradition, unintended tradition that I've been noticing over the past like several years, and it's this thing where I always forget to take family photos for that dreaded Christmas card, like photo card that I keep having to make. And I do it too late. Like I think about it too late. And so last minute in the fall, near the end of fall, we're like scrambling to get a picture like on the iPhone. And it's always so stressful, but we do get it in. And the only reason I keep doing these Christmas photo cards is because I did it, for so many years that now I can't stop. And that's like the worst reason to ever do anything. But that is the fall tradition that I think of. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's fall. It's time for us to like stress out over Christmas photo cards that nobody wants. Nobody wants to make, but here I am doing them every year because I just can't bring myself to like end that. There's mine. How about you, Joan?
So I'm actually really, really into pumpkin carving as a fun fact. I'm gonna go on my phone to get some pictures just to show. But I carve like 2 or 3 pumpkins each year, and I get very, very competitive about it with my siblings. So here, I did Venom one year.
Oh my gosh, that's so good.
Thank you. Here's Gandalf. You can't really tell.
Oh, no, you can. Oh my
Yeah, so like
gosh.
I do like a little bit of pumpkin carving every year. Oh, here's a Captain America one I did. It's kind of fun.
Okay, are you gonna do one for your book for this,
I'm
Halloween?
debating. There's a lot of debate
Okay.
about. I really want to do a Jurassic Park one. Like I've always wanted to do like the dinosaur, but I'll be sure to post it
No,
once
you
it's
have to do
done,
one
just so
for your
everybody can see
book.
what I do. Yeah, it might. We'll see. But yeah, so I'm gonna be carving a lot of pumpkins within the next month,
Yay.
just because that's kind of like how I like to spend my fall. And then my in-laws, my grandparents-in-law, are holding a massive Halloween party, which I'm very excited for. So I'm gonna make a very fun costume with my husband, and we're gonna go to that.
Yeah, I feel like you either have to do it for your book, or maybe you can get all of your siblings to do it for your book and have a contest.
Yay!
Oh, that's true.
And like see which one is best.
And
Then
then we
it's
just have
also like a test to see if they've
Mhm.
read your book.
There you go.
My sister actually said she wants to do a Taily Bones costume for Halloween, so we'll see
Oh wow.
how that turns out. Yeah, but
Well, that sounds amazing. I'm in awe. I'm not good at pumpkin carving, despite my best efforts.
it is such a useless talent, but I'm so glad I have it. Like, if that makes sense. Like, if I
No,
could
it's so
exchange it for
cool.
parallel parking, I would. But like,
Does it count?
Okay, well, I mean, if you put it like that.
I use templates. Does that still count, or is that like cheating?
no, I totally think it counts. I feel
It's
like
so much
Yeah,
templates
I
are a
think
good
it
base.
does. Because I think part of what I have a hard time with pumpkin carving is not like the yes, the artistic thing, obviously. But the second one is like the actual, it's hard to figure out how much force to use and like how to be precise on it. Like I just can't. Mine always just end up being just like not even a smile or not even like a frown. It's just whatever shape randomly happens. It just goes off the rails immediately upon first cut or like first poke. It's like, well,
Yeah, I will say there's like truly nothing more devastating than spending hours on a pumpkin and then having like one piece fall out and you just have to like stick it in with a toothpick like sideways.
yeah. Oh no.
No, that's
I think it's really
that's a gig.
cool.
Thank you. Yeah,
I
it's
love
fun.
them.
So,
I'll have to definitely check back by the end of October to see which pumpkins have made the feed.
yeah. I'll post a couple of them. Maybe like
Yeah.
one per day because I haven't posted any of my other pumpkins. And I have it going back to
Oh.
like high school is like when I started doing like
Wow.
really intense pumpkin carving.
Oh wow. So you probably could do like one every day, right? If you have so many from like the years.
Potentially. There's a lot that like just did not turn out at all. Just like which one are you gonna do?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah.
Thank you everyone who is watching. Thank you to the amazing questions that we've got. Thank you to Jenna and Joan. I've put both of their links to the book in the description box below. So definitely check those out. It's perfect timing for spooky season, either for you or any middle grade people, actually anyone. It's perfect timing to give it to anyone, as we've all proven. Like there's no age limit on when you read and enjoy middle grade books. And I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day and enjoys spooky-tober or spooktober or whatever it is called.
Thank you so
Absolutely.
much,
Thanks for
Lily.
having us.